today we're going to explore a couple of topics that we've talked about a little bit in previous episodes. The first of which is the consequences of temperature on the behaviour of animals, and in particular ectotherms, those cold-blooded animals. And also habitat choice, the decisions that animals make to settle in a particular environment. And we're going to explore both of these topics together and expand on them in the context of a new topic, which is central place foragers. Now, what is a central place forager? It is an animal that invests a lot of time and effort into some type of central refuge. It could be a nest in the case of a bird or meat ants, which we'll talk about later on in this episode, or it could be what I've got behind me here, and a burrow. So that is a wombat burrow, and that wombat has spent a lot of time and energy digging out that hole into a whole network of burrows, and it uses it as a central refuge. That's why we call these animals central place foragers. So each evening it will come out of its burrow and it will go out across the landscape foraging, and at the end of the evening, at dawn, it will return to the shelter of that burrow. So there are clear advantages to having a central refuge to return to periodically. For example, obviously it might actually shelter an animal from fluctuations in the environment, such as temperature changes, rainfall, all sorts of different things from a even seasonal context as well. It might actually provide protection against potential predation as well, and to some extent parasitism. So there are adaptive reasons why a lot of species actually invest heavily in a central refuge of some form. In the case of nesting birds, that central nest is really important for reproduction, obviously. But there is a trade-off. While there is adaptive advantages, there's also a constraint, and that is that these species are essentially rooted in location. So this wombat has spent a lot of time and effort digging out that burrow, and if the conditions change in the surrounding environment and they persist long enough, for example, prolonged drought or flooding, perhaps increase in bushfire intensity, what does a central place forager do? It has a limit on its ability to just pick up and move and disperse to a new location. And the reason for that is because they've invested so much in that central refuge. So the idea is the central place foragers, these species are particularly vulnerable to environmental change. And we're going to explore that in the context of meat ants, which we've talked about in previous episodes. And we're going to explore it in the context of what happens when the environment changes so much that the survival and reproduction of an animal is subsequently compromised. What do these central place foragers do? And we're going to explore it in the context of the current climate crisis as well. So in front of me is a meat ant nest. It's a relatively small one by comparison to a lot of the other colonies around here. But meat ants are an iconic Australian insect. These nests dominate a lot of southeastern Australia, and so it's very quintessential Australia. Now, these nests can also be many years old. So this nest is probably about 6 or 7 years old. There are other nests around here that are decades old. So this is a central refuge. So meat ants, and this nest in particular, is a classic example of a central placed forager. Each day, once it's warm enough, the workers will move out along foraging trails to pick up all sorts of things from seeds to dead insects, even dead lizards, and anything that will be brought back to sustain the nest. Because the behaviour of meat ants and insects in particular are so dependent on temperature, the placement of these nests is really important. Meat ants spend a lot of time and effort creating these nests. It provides shelter, it provides protection to some extent from predation, from echidnas for example. But it's important to get the position right. it has to balance enough sun and enough shade to maintain a particular thermal niche. And that is because there is a particular set of temperatures where these ants can actually move out and forage and sustain the nest. If it's too cold, too much shade, or if it's too hot, too much sun, then these ants can't actually emerge from the nest to sustain the nest. So the position of these nests is really critical, and because they're so long-lived, it raises a really interesting question, which is general for all central place foragers. If you get your original spot of your refuge wrong, what is the consequences of that? For example, out here we've had severe drought, and what happened is that these nests were all along the forest edge, balancing out enough shade, enough sun to maintain a particular thermal niche. But with the drought, a lot of tree dieback, the foliage started to thin out, a lot of the vegetation around here thinned out as well, and a lot of nests became too exposed to solar radiation and became too hot. So the question is, what happens to a central place forager if the conditions in the environment change? Particularly for long-lived species such as the meat ant, these colonies can be decades old. So out here, we're running an experiment to actually test to what extent changing the conditions of the surface of the nest, raising it up so it's warmer, cooling it down through shade so it's cooler, what impact does that have on the colony itself? And importantly, do these animals change their behavior to compensate for conditions fluctuating or becoming less than optimal? Do they send out more workers during that short window that they have actually got for actually going out and foraging? So the experiment is just running over here on my shoulder. We've got one of the treatments, so how about we go over there and check it out. So underneath this tarp is a meat ant nest, and it's part of a big experiment that I'm running out here, looking at that general question of what's the consequence of getting that nest location wrong? Or more generally, what's the consequence for central place foragers with positioning a central refuge, a nest, in a particular location that might be optimal at one time point, but things change and becomes the conditions at that site become suboptimal. This tarpaulin is semi-transparent, so the sun can come through and heat the surface of the nest up, but the heat can't dissipate, so it acts as a greenhouse effect. There are other nests that have the same structure but have shade cloth over the top of it to create a change in cooler temperatures. And the whole setup is surrounded by this electrical fence. And the reason being is that we've got quite a few wombats out here, and they love scratching themselves against things like fence posts and experimental setups. So they're very strong and they tend to break things as a consequence. The electrical fence is just to give them a little bit of a incentive not to go near their setup. On the surface of the nest, there is a temperature probe, which also measures humidity. And then that goes back to a data logger, which is in that white housing there. And so we measure the behavior of the swarm. So we set up a camera on top of the nest and we scrape it and see all those ants bubbling out. The swarm behavior is a really important anti-predator strategy for meat ants. We also set up cameras along foraging trails and we record the number of ants that are moving out and coming back in along those trails. We do this over and over again at different time points throughout the day and at different temperatures throughout the day. We also do that in the middle of summer when it's blistering hot, and we also do it in the middle of winter, like now, where the temperature is a lot cooler, so much so there's actually frost on the ground. And the idea is that this experiment should change the surface temperature of these nests, should raise it, particularly during summer, but also keep a higher temperature in winter compared to those shade treatments, which might actually fare reasonably well in summer, but really start to suffer because they're too cold in winter. So, with this setup in mind, we can actually investigate the consequences of the environment changing for this key central place forager. So getting it wrong can be dire for these ants. Now this nest used to be a thriving nest of roughly about 500,000 ants. And over the space of just a few weeks, because the environment changed, it became a little bit too hot, the entire colony has gone extinct. Quite sobering. You know, you have to wonder about the fate of species that are central place foragers, that invest so heavily in that single location that it's hard for those animals to just pick up and move. I mean, imagine our wombat who spent so much time and energy developing that network of burrows, only for the environment around him or her to suddenly change. With the climate crisis, we have increasing events of severe drought where watercourses that were previously considered to be permanent just disappear, where watercourses that were pretty tame suddenly become less than tame. In particular, bushfire is becoming more frequent, it's becoming more intense. In the context of our wombats and our meat ants of the world, these species are particularly vulnerable to environmental change. They've invested so much in that single location that perhaps their fate may not actually be a good one as the environment progressively changes around them. But we can hope, and this is what the experiment that we've set up here is hoping to answer, that perhaps animals can adapt their behaviour, they can change their behaviour, they're flexible, they're plastic, and they can subsequently cope with quite drastic changes in their environment through behavioural changes, perhaps spending more time foraging at select times of the day or night. So my hope is at the end of this experiment, there will actually be a good news story out of this, that, well, the climate is changing, but perhaps some of our animals can potentially persist despite that.